Welcome to another edition of Old Testament Survey. This is number 27 in the sequence of lectures through the Old Testament. We're in 1 Samuel, beginning at chapter 16. And as we left David behind last time. We haven't quite gotten to him yet. We were looking at King Saul. One of the most interesting distinctions in the Old Testament is the distinction between Saul and David. Saul is the first king of Israel. He was foreknown by God. He was chosen by God. He was filled with God's Spirit. He was operating according to God's intentions. This was Saul was not a bad man. He did a great deal of good things. He was a little crazy, but he was not a bad guy. The sins of Saul amounted to disobedience in the technical rules um, for either sacrifice or for the slaughtering of enemies. Um, when we compare the life of Saul with the life of David, we find that David is also a chosen man. He is foreknown. Uh, he is empowered by God's Spirit. He has a new heart within him. Uh, when we compare the description of the spiritual beginnings of David and Saul, we find that they are both believers. Uh, when we look at David's life and compare that to Saul's life, I think it's very obvious that David's sins, at least those that are recorded, are significantly worse than those committed by Saul. Now, Saul may have done some other things along the way that we're not told about, but uh, uh, when we compare David and Saul with just what's recorded, David looks like the bad guy. And yet, at the end of the day, we're told that David is a man after God's heart, Saul is not. As we get farther into the David story, I want to think through why that is. But I'm going to give you the bottom line now. As we study the Saul and David story, I want you to remember that God doesn't save us because we're good. God saves us because he is good. Salvation is always by the grace of God and received by faith. Salvation never depends on our good works. Now, our blessing depends on good works. Saul lost his blessing. On the other hand, David did not. And there's something more that's going on here. And that's what we'll be looking at, part of what we'll be looking at. In this section of First Samuel, we're going to go on into the life of David. And we see David introduced in chapter 16, and then comes the most famous event in David's life, well known to every grade school kid, the story of David and Goliath. Something is beeping like crazy, so I am going to. I've got to stop here and make a thing stop beeping, whatever it is. Okay, sorry about that. When your office is full of beeping objects, sometimes you have to do what you have to do. So we're going to go on to chapter 16. I'm going to begin sharing the screen if I can manage it and get the slideshow up. And here we have it. Oh, right. Oops. Oops. All right. That should be, that's not sharing, is it? I don't think that's working for me. Okay, we're going to try that again. And then we'll do this. And that should come out in presenter view, and it didn't. So I stopped this one. Gee, I love this. Does everybody else like this as much as I do? Yeah, I didn't think so. There it is. Okay, now we've got, this is a picture taken in the Negev desert of Judea. It gives you an idea of what shepherding is really like. You'll notice there's one grown up in the group that looks like somebody's mom, although it's really hard to tell when people are all wrapped up in their burqas or whatever she's wearing there. It's tough to tell what you're looking at. But shepherding is something that was done by the women, the children. It's not considered a man's work, except every once in a while. Sometimes you'll see men way off in the middle of nowhere with their sheep. But here, these sheep are just walking along the highway with some little kids with sticks, making them do what they do. It's kind of fun to watch. David in chapter 16 is introduced to us as a shepherd. His job as the youngest son, at the age of probably 15 or 16 years old, is to take care of the sheep out in the wilderness. Uh, and we're introduced to David as the chosen one of God. So the Lord said to Samuel in 16:1, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I've rejected him. Fill your horn with oil. I'll send you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I've provided for myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears, he'll kill me." The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say that I've come to sacrifice to the Lord, and invite Jesse to the sacrifice. I'll show you what you should do. Afterwards, you will anoint for me him whom I declare to you." And then we go on through a bit more story here, but it's obvious that David is already God's chosen one. He is the man after God's heart. We're going to be introduced to Jesse's family, the rest of the sons. In every case, the son who is pointed out turns out to be the wrong one, uh, and Jesse wants his older sons to be the chosen one, but God says, "This isn't the one. This isn't the one." Finally, uh, Jesse admits that there is yet another in the field with the sheep, and he comes, and the Lord says, "Arise, anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil, verse 13, and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel went home to Ramah. Okay, so David was foreknown. David was specifically chosen by God. The Spirit of God came upon him with power. Uh, this is the same kind of call experience that Saul had. These are both saved men, and the experience is the same. So the failure of Saul can't be put down to the idea that he was not a believer. He was, and David can't be contrasted in that way. They were both believers. Something else is going on. In chapter 17, well, rest of chapter 16, we see Saul taking David into his service, which is kind of interesting. The Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and there was a harmful spirit from God. Some of our translations say an evil spirit from God. And the word can be translated both ways. A lot of our modern translations are saying harmful. That's actually a good translation. We don't want to be thinking that this is a demon sent by God. It's more on the order of a mental illness. But there's some mystery here. We don't really know everything that we would like to know about this spirit who is sent from God to torment Saul. And apparently some music was helpful. And in the next slide, I've got the harp that David played. Well, actually not. This harp actually comes from Mesopotamia, but it's the same kind of shape and size as David would have used. So back to this. Chapter 17 of 1 Samuel is a high point in the David narrative, a high point in the David story. It's really something that David looks back to all the rest of his life as the most significant event that ever happened to him. It was his greatest battle, his greatest success, the demonstration of the presence of God in him. What happens in the David and Goliath battle is right up there at the top of David's list. So let's set it up. And to do that, let's see. I believe you've got some notes that lay out the general geography of the battle. This is going to take place, the 17:1. The Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in the Elah Valley, a place called Ephes Demim. Azekah is a fairly large old Canaanite city that would eventually become an Israelite city. It's a fairly important place and has not been well excavated, but it's been done. Soko shows some signs of occupation. Soko is a much smaller hill than Azekah. The two of them are about 2 kilometers apart. The Elah Valley, the little brook Elah, passes between Soko and Azekah on its way out to the Mediterranean Sea. Toward the east, the Elah goes up into the Judean hills of Israel, and it divides into 2 parts. There's one valley that goes up to Jerusalem and another valley that goes down to Hebron. The Jerusalem valley leads up to Bethlehem, which is the direction that David would have come down. The valley between Azekah and Soko is probably 300 meters across, fairly flat, with just the one creek running through the middle of it, and would have been a good place for a battle. There's a fairly well-defined piece of ground. The Philistines were on their way from the coast up toward the Judean hill country. And the Elah Valley was one of 3 valleys that the Philistines could drive up. They could come up the Elah, or the Sorek, or the Ajalon. Those are the 3 valleys that give access to the central hills. The Ajalon and the Elah are fairly easy, I mean, comparatively. The Sorek Valley is the place where Samson fought his battles and stopped the Philistines from coming any further up. The Ajalon Valley is where Saul fought the Philistines. So the Battle of Michmash actually defends the upper ground of the Ajalon Valley north of Jerusalem. The third battle for valleys is going to happen here in chapter 17. This is the Philistines doing their last possible attack up the valley routes, and they're going to come in from the south up the Elah Valley. So they came up for the day, they deployed their army, set up camp in the Elah Valley, facing toward the east. Saul heard what was going on. He came down from Gibeah, gathered an army with him. They came down the northern branch of the Elah through Bethlehem and set up at the edge of the hills. A notable feature of the edge of the hills is very rugged ground made out of chalk. We sometimes call it the chalk moat. The chalk moat serves as a barrier between the hill country and the lower, more gentle Shfela country. Roads going through this area always have to be paved with stone because the ground is either soft and wet. It's a bottomless mud pit in the wet season, or it dries into a dust that is also nearly bottomless. So the road is very important. That means that anybody going by with an army up and down the Elah Valley is going to have to cross on the road. And having crossed by the road, they have to go up into the Judean hills on one of two paths, either to the left heading toward Bethlehem or to the right heading toward Hebron. And both valleys are V-shaped, rocky bottom valleys. Saul was nobody's fool, and he set up, very likely as infantry in a defensive position along that chalk moat in amongst the rocks and guarding the entrance to the V-shaped valley beyond. The Philistines were a mobile army. They had chariots. The chariots were very good out in the open, out in the broad valley. They didn't work at all well, single file on a narrow rocky road being shot at by bad guys behind rocks. For this reason, Saul only went as far as the rocky chalk moat, and the Philistines came no farther than Soko and Azekah. I'm going to show you some pictures of the spot itself. This is an aerial view from Soko, not Soko, from Azekah. That's Azekah in the foreground, and you can see the modern kibbutz of Gath in the distance. Just a little farther along is the Mediterranean Sea. We're actually very close to the Mediterranean. The Elah Valley is to the right. This shot is taken from the floor of the Elah Valley. Actually, I'm sitting on Soko with a long lens looking at Azekah there in the distance. That bald hill is Azekah, bald and flat topped. You can tell that there was an ancient city there. Soko is the hill that I'm standing on, and there's the other hill, well, probably 300 meters away off to the right. If I put on my wide angle lens from the same spot, you can see the broad valley of the Elah. I'm going to turn about 45 degrees. And we'll look straight across the valley now. And then one more turn, we look up the valley toward the east. Where you see those Telstar dishes is the spot where Saul would have set up his forces. Beyond the satellite dishes is the Judean hill country, and the road gets very windy and narrow. So the battle had to take place right here. This is the only spot. I've got one more shot here. This isn't a great shot, but it's the only one I have of the rocky bottom of the Ala itself. And here's a couple of men going through the pile of rocks at the bottom of the Ala, looking for 5 smooth stones, which is what everybody does here. Back in the day, the tour buses would stop here and people would all get off and pick up rocks. There were the tradition is there were a couple of Baptist pastors in Jerusalem who once a week would take a pickup to the Galilee and come down with rocks to refill this area. I'm not sure how true that is, but anyway, this is there's often flint in the base of the Ala, so this is the spot, and the reason for David's battle here is the geography. It's yeah, the only way this battle could have worked is the way it did. Uh, then we come to the interesting time. Um, Here they are. Saul and his men were gathered. They drew up, and there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. The word champion there is an interesting Hebrew phrase. The Hebrew ish habenayim, ish is man, and benayim is an interesting dual form. It means in between. The ish habenayim is a man of the in between. The word is used of skirmishers, uh, men who would go out and try to get a fight started before before the rest of the army was really ready to begin obeying orders. The problem with ancient Near Eastern warfare is that it's a brutal, dirty, grim, bloody affair. It's a terrible thing. You can look at some of the weapons on the left there. How would you like to be poked with that spear or hit in the head with that mace? It's a terrible thing. Whether you're the one getting killed or you're the one doing the killing, it's not something that anybody goes into enthusiastically. So skirmishers were often set out to uh, get the blood up, to get the enthusiasm for battle. They would go out into the no man's land, the in between area, as representatives of their army, and shout insults, run and threaten, rattle their spears, all of these sorts of things to try to get the other army angry enough to come and fight. Goliath was part of a family of giants. Uh, we know from the rest of 1 Samuel that there were at least 4 others in his family, and they may have been present at this battle. We're not told, but it makes sense. David did, after all, pick up 5 smooth stones. He knew that with 1 stone he was going to kill Goliath, and the little guys weren't going to come after him once he'd done that. So he only needed 4 more stones for the other 4 big guys. Goliath was on the order of 3 meters tall. That would make him a very, very tall man. Most most men today, even American basketball players, rarely get as high as 1 meter 40 or so, or 2 meters 40. That would be a very, very tall man. I'm trying to think of who comes close. The famous basketball player Wilt Chamberlain was like 6'10" or something like that, almost 7 feet tall. So that would be really, really, really big. We don't have people as big as Goliath today, for the most part. They have all kinds of health problems. Goliath is a bit of a rarity. Now, we know there were giants in the ancient world. There is archaeological evidence for giants in Canaan and giants in the Mediterranean islands. And I'm not going to walk through all of that detail, but the giant story is not just made up. It is, in fact, something that can be at least illustrated in the ancient world. We don't know exactly how that worked, but it did. So we've got this guy, a champion, a man of the in-between named Goliath. And he had a helmet of bronze. He was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of his coat was 1,000 shekels of bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, which means it was wound with cord, apparently to give him something to grip. He stood and shouted. He says, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And you, the servants of Saul, choose a man for yourselves. Let him come down to me. If he's able to kill me, then we'll serve you. And if I kill him, then you'll serve us." So he was challenging the people of Israel to single combat. And what he was asking for was that the men of Israel choose for themselves a man of the in-between. This word is sometimes used of a diplomat or a mediator, someone who will get between the two sides and solve the problem. Pick yourself a mediator, pick yourself a representative, if you will, a man of the in-between to represent your army and have him fight me. Well, no one was particularly happy about that. By the time we get to verse 11, Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine and were greatly afraid. Now, we've already been told that Saul was a tall, handsome man, head and shoulders above everyone else in Israel. Saul should have been the man of the in-between. He was chosen by the people who insisted that God give them a king to go out before them into battle. This was the king's job. As Saul was as afraid as everyone else. Verse 12 tells us, now David. So here David is introduced. Interestingly, he's already been in Saul's court, but Saul doesn't know him. So here comes David, the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 eldest followed Saul to the battle, and they went down, and David stayed back with the sheep. And for 40 days, verse 16, the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. So what we have going on here is a morning and evening affair for 40 days. And of course, neither side was quite willing to go out to battle. And so Jesse sent David with some food for his sons, and Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning, and off he went. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper, and he went down and he saw Goliath, and he heard his boasting, and the men of Israel fled. And David uh, uh, looked on at this in verse 25. The men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. The king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel." That last one means no taxes, which is in anybody's book in any era a pretty good thing. So lots of money. The king's daughter in marriage, uh, would depend on who the daughter was, but no taxes. That's a really good thing. And so David said, "What shall be done with the man?" And you know, they told him. And David said, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So David makes this a religious issue. It's not merely military. This Goliath has defied the armies of God. And you just don't do that. You can't get away with that. And David couldn't let Goliath get away with this. And the people answered him, "So shall it be done." And David's eldest brother Eliab heard all of this, and he was angry with David. But David said, "Well, let no man's heart fail because of this. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul heard this, and that was David's message to King Saul. Saul says, "Well, here, go ahead, try on this armor." David tried to put on the armor, but he just wasn't big enough. He was probably 15 or 16 years old. He was just a boy, and still hadn't gotten his full size yet. The muscles hadn't developed yet. So that just emphasizes the distinction between the David and Goliath characters. And Saul says, "Well, how can I let you do this?" And uh, David says, "Your servant has struck down both lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them. He has defied the armies of the living God." And Saul finally decided to let him try that. And David took his staff in his hand, picked up 5 smooth stones. This is in verse 40. And he put them in his pouch. His sling was in his hand. He approached the Philistine. The Philistine said to David, verse 43, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And David replied in verse 45, "You come to me with a sword and spear and javelin. I come to you in the name of the living God, the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head." Well, that didn't go over well. And Goliath rose and came down to meet David. And he's obviously angry. He can hardly wait to get going here. David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, and slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. Now, those of you who've never tried to sling a stone should recognize that this is a fairly difficult skill. It's a very simple weapon. It's a leather pouch on the end of a leather thong, two-ended leather thong. You swing this around and let it go at exactly the right time, and away goes the stone. It's very, very hard to control that stone. When I was a boy, I tried and absolutely couldn't come anywhere close to anything. I have known other boys who did a bit better, but it's a really hard skill to master. David had mastered the skill. He picked up one stone, hit Goliath in the forehead, and down Goliath came. It would have been a stunning blow. The blow would have broken the forepiece of Goliath's helmet. It would have to have broken the bronze helmet and pushed everything into Goliath's forehead. That would have broken the bridge of his nose. Uh, that's a break that isn't necessarily fatal, but it would definitely be stunning. Is a kind of a stroke that would make a man see stars for a moment, and perhaps he would fall. Well, Goliath went down, and it would have been a slow fall, like a big tree in the forest. And all of the Philistine lines and the Israelite lines behind watched this happen in slow motion as David walked over toward this falling character. The armor bearer ran to get out of the way, and David pulled the sword from Goliath's sheath, raised it high, and probably took a couple of strokes to come up with Goliath's head. He took Goliath's head off and displayed it for his own army and for the army of the Philistines. A panic set in amongst the Philistines. They began to run. Saul's army chased them, and it was a great battle. They took a left at Azekah and headed out for Gath. There's a gas station on that corner today, and I like to tell people who are with me in the Elah Valley that the Philistines took a right at the Gath station on their way out to Gath as Israel followed them down that road. And so a very great battle. David was acting as Israel's man of the in-between. David went down into the valley of the shadow of death. For certainly, Goliath represents certain death to anyone who looked at him. And there in the valley of the shadow of death, David faced Goliath alone, representing his entire army. And at the end of the confrontation, he came up with Goliath's head. David beat death at his own game. In this way, David is actually a type or an illustration of the work of Christ. David is a type of Christ here. We're going to see that David is a type of Christ in more than one way. And he is an emblem, a precursor of the work of the Messiah in several ways. We'll get to that in 2 Samuel. This event for David is the biggest thing that ever happened in David's life. He can look back on this as that day that he was a hero. He did something no one else could have done, and it's a remarkable victory. So as we move on, we see in chapters 18 and on into 19, David is brought prominently into Saul's court. The first thing we're told about is David's friendship with Jonathan. Jonathan is Saul's number one son. And the important thing to understand about Jonathan is that he would be the next king of Israel. Saul is the king. The next in line would be Jonathan. So Jonathan's friendship with David here is the beginnings of an act of treason. David will go out to battle for Saul, leading the armies of Israel. And often they will be fighting the Philistines and often the Ammonites. There are many battles during these years. We're not told details about many of them, but we are told that when David would come back from battle, the women of the towns would sing to one another in the popular songs of the day. Saul has struck down his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Eventually, that got on Saul's nerves. He was jealous of David, and when a harmful spirit from the Lord came upon him, Saul tried to kill David several times with his sword or in other ways, with his spear to pin him to the wall. Eventually, Saul decided to let the Philistines kill David. So he gave David his daughter Michal as a wife. And David says, well, I don't have the bride price. Saul says, well, you can bring me so many foreskins of Philistines. So kill a bunch of Philistines and bring me the evidence, and that would be the bride price, thinking that he would let the Philistines do the killing. And it just didn't work. Chapter 19, we see David escaping from Saul a second time. Eventually, David has to run. In chapter 20, Jonathan tells David, "You better run. You're not going to be able to get away from him." And we've got David hiding out in the field, and Jonathan bringing a message to David in the form of arrows. And he's got a young man going after the arrows, and he says, "Go a little further. The arrow is beyond you," which is the message: get away, run now. You're not going to be able to serve in Saul's court any longer. And that takes us to chapter 21. David is going to be on his way to Gath, but on the way, he's hungry and unarmed. And on the way, he stops at a place called Nob, N-O-B, which is the hill at the north end of the Kidron Valley in Jerusalem. So from the old city of Jerusalem, you look north and east, and there's the hill. Have I got? Yes, I do. Here's Jerusalem, and that's Nob in the background on the right. The buildings that you see up there are the modern Hebrew University of Jerusalem. That's the spot. Anyway, here we are at Nob, and the high priest is Ahimelech. Ahimelech came out to meet him. David says, "I could use some food. I could use some weapons." So, oh well, I suppose you could, but why don't you have anything? And David says, well, the king's business requires haste, which indeed it did, because the king's business was to kill David. But there was a certain man of the servants of Saul who was there that day by the name of Doeg, who was an Edomite. Now we're told all the way through all the way through the Old Testament, don't you be trusting Edomites. They're likely to be no good. Well, Doeg was not helpful. So David took the showbread from the tabernacle, and then he took the sword of Goliath. From there, he fled to Gath. Gath is one of the Philistine cities, to a king by the name of Achish. And the servants of Achish said to him, "Is this not David, the king of the land, of whom they sing their songs? Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands." So everybody's heard this song. And uh, Achish said, "Well, I guess you're right." So David pretended to be insane, drooling on his shirt and behaving strangely. Uh, the king Achish says, "Have I no madmen of my own that you bring them here to me?" And David managed to make his escape and ended up first at the cave of Adullam, and then ultimately crossed the Jordan into Moab. Now, the cave of Adullam is important. This is in chapter 22, the first few verses. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. We would love to know where that cave is, but the fact is we don't know where that cave is. It could be anywhere. We believe it's on the way to Moab, uh, but there are a lot of places that could be on the way to Moab. So he went to this cave, and his brothers and all his father's house heard of it, and they went down to him there, which is a good sign. His own brothers and his household felt strongly enough about David that they were willing to join him here. And then we hear about the rest of them. Everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was bitter in their soul gathered to him. Okay, but you look at these guys, they're in trouble of some kind or another. Maybe the sheriff is after them. They're in debt. They borrowed too much on a new chainsaw, whatever they wanted to buy, and now they're in debt. They can't pay it back, and so the creditors are chasing them, go to repossess the chainsaw. And so you've got the sheriff coming from one direction, and the bank and the repo man coming from another direction, and because of it, they're just plain bitter, just kind of grim and grotesque inside their souls. Now, this is not the kind of people that you want. If you're going to start a big mass movement, it's good to start out with uh, men with great character. David does not get that luxury. He starts out with 600 men. There are going to be 400 at Adullam. It will eventually swell to 600 men and eventually wives and children. And David became their leader. This is one of the most important elements of the David story because David had done a great deed. He'd killed Goliath. That was a absolutely masterful thing. And then he'd gone on to lead men in battle. What he begins to do at the cave of Adullam is much more important. In Adullam, David began to disciple leaders. He began to train men to do the kinds of things that he had done. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how many giants you kill. What matters is how many giant killers you train. David was the trainer of giant killers. We're going to run into the confirmation of that later on in the Samuel series. The most important thing that David did with his whole life was to train men to replace himself. David understood that his life would be short, but if he could train men to replace himself, his movement could last forever. Now, nothing ever does, but the principle is there. And the reason we make disciples as a church is so that the next generation can replace us. And we do that with every generation. Okay, that's chapter 22, Saul and the priests of Nob. Terrible thing. Saul insisted that the priests of Nob who had cooperated with David, even unknowingly, be put to death. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, named Abiathar, escaped from the massacre and told David what had happened. And Abiathar became part of David's group. Chapter 23, we see the pursuit of David in the wilderness. While David is being pursued, Saul chases him. He occasionally does a good thing. A place called Keilah is an Israelite settlement. We're not told exactly where. They're in the Philistine country. And David organizes a battle, even though his own men are frightened. He said, "We're afraid here in Judah. We're going to be, it's even worse if we go to a place like that." This is very early on in David's experience with these men, and he begins to train them with what is probably not a terribly difficult battle. But he helps them overcome their own fears and demonstrates that by trusting the Lord, the battle can be won. David beat the Philistines at Keilah. He saved the inhabitants. They went on from there to En-Gedi, and I think I've got a thing here. Let's see. Oh, there it is. This shot is an aerial shot of En-Gedi. I didn't take this shot. I wish I had. This shot was actually taken immediately after a flood, a flash flood. You can see the broken spots in the road down below. En-Gedi means goat spring. And this isn't a goat, that's me some years ago at the entrance to the valley of En-Gedi. En-Gedi is a perennial spring. The water comes out of the Kidron Valley in Jerusalem and runs underground for a while. It comes all the way out to the Dead Sea. So En-Gedi is an oasis. Today it is a nature preserve. It has this hiking trail that you can see that's fairly easy for people to walk up. There's a parking lot and a gift shop and all of that sort of thing at the end, and the buses drive up, and people walk all the way up this En-Gedi nature preserve. Along the way, on both sides of the valley, you can see caves. And of course, if you go with an Israeli tour guide, he'll point out the cave where David cut off Saul's robe, but we don't know. It could be any of them. There are thousands of caves up here. But it's easy to visualize David and his guys going up and down these mountains as Saul and his army is chasing them. David and his guys were probably very lightly equipped. They couldn't afford armor. Saul and his men were fully equipped with heavy armor and heavy swords and spears and shields and all the rest. Can you imagine how much fun it would be on a hot summer's day to try to climb one of those mountains in full armor? So it's no big surprise that David and his guys were routinely able to get away from Saul and his army. So here we are looking down into the upper reaches of the valley. There's another shot. During a flash flood, this gets to be a very wet place. Here is one of several springs along the way. The whole En-Gedi area is reasonably well watered. And this terribly frightening little animal is, what is that guy called? We only find these little characters in the En-Gedi wilderness, the Dead Sea wilderness area. Uh, he's about the size of a small rabbit, and very, very timid. They're difficult to spot. I got this one with a 300 millimeter lens many years ago, and they're just kind of cute. But you find them at En Gedi. I hope David didn't ever have to eat any of these. This is a temple at En Gedi that dates back to at least 3,000 years before Christ. So this is not the temple of Yahweh. It's an interesting place to visit, though, because it shows all of the same structural parts of temples and tabernacles throughout the whole ancient world uh, at the time of David and long before and long after. Okay, that's En Gedi. That's David's spot. Um, David is going to spare the life of Saul twice, once at En Gedi, a second time later at another camp. Here in chapter 24, David actually sneaks into the cave, cuts off the hem of his garment and some other stuff. He grabs some stuff. Later on, he goes with another of his men and takes a spear and a water jug. And both times, David makes it known that he was in position to do Saul great harm, but he didn't do it because he refused to lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. And the anointed means the one chosen to be the king. Saul had been chosen as king. Now, notice Saul hadn't been chosen as prophet or as preacher or as elder or any of those other terms. Um, we carry the term too far when we argue that no one must ever criticize the pastor. Sometimes we have to criticize the pastor. I have a tendency not to. I've been on the receiving end of that. But this is not a verse that forbids us to criticize the pastor. We should hold the pastor in high respect, but sometimes a pastor needs to be disciplined. Um, Sometimes an elder needs to be disciplined. They're not above the rules. The king, on the other hand, is also not above the rules, but only God can take him out. That was David's point. In chapter 25, we see the note of Saul's death, and then a series of marriages. David with Abigail. Abigail was a wife of a not a very smart man whose name was Nabal. There it is. I've got it underlined here, and I'm having trouble finding it. Nabal means fool. Nabal was a fool. He was not a very nice guy. He was a fairly wealthy man with a bunch of sheep and goats and whatnot. And David had protected that family for a while, had protected the camp. And eventually he sent messengers saying, we've been here as helpful as we could be, and we're happy to do that. If you wouldn't mind, we would appreciate some food from your herd. Would you mind putting on a feast for us? And they were polite, and it was expected. It actually would have been a reasonable thing for Nabal to do. And he said, "Oh no, there are men all over the place raising up their hands against their masters. I'm not going to be any use to you. I'm not going to support you." And David was angry, and he shouldn't have been, but he was angry, and decided to kill Nabal and the whole camp and just take what he wanted. Which would not have been a good thing to do, let's face it. But that's what David was intending. Abigail, on the other hand, is a woman of some common sense who decided to take matters into her own hands. She prepared a bunch of food, went out to meet David, and said, "My husband is a fool. as is his name, so is he, but it would be better if you didn't do this thing. So here's the food that you need. I'd be happy to provide this for you. And David recognized, one, that his own anger was over the top. He shouldn't have been so angry. Two, that Abigail was a really sensible woman. So he apparently really liked this lady, really respected her. Afterwards, Nabal is told about what Abigail has done, and he's so angry his heart failed him, and he fell over and within a few days was dead. David, being a nice guy, offered to marry the poor widow. Uh, and I suspect there's more going on than that. Uh, and on both sides of the equation, but Abigail becomes one of David's wives. He's already married to Michael, and now he's got Abigail. And along the way, he's going to end up with some others. David begins putting together what we later on in Arabic will call a harem, a collection of wives. This is not right. It's not acceptable. This is going to lead David to all kinds of problems. His family is going to be impossible because of the multiple marriages. Okay, chapter 26, we see David sparing Saul again. David eventually is going to flee to the Philistines in chapter 27. Back to Achish, who this time is willing to take David on as a mercenary. And we're going to see David serving the Philistines as a mercenary in chapters 27, 8, 9, and 30. So all of this is going on. As this is going on, David attacks Israel's enemies, while at the same time telling the Philistines that he's attacking Philistine enemies. The dilemma that David finally faces is that the Philistines decide on an attack on Israel. And David, of course, being a mercenary, is expected to go along for the ride. David was kind of stuck there. He just about had to go. And we see that in chapter 27. But as that battle was laying out, it's going to happen in the north of Israel. Mount Gilboa is in the northern part of the hill country of Manasseh on the south side of the Jezreel Valley. Just to the north of the Jezreel Valley at that point is this tell, which is Bet Shan. And we'll come back to Bet Shan in a minute. This particular picture doesn't serve very well, but Saul and his army went up to Gilboa because the Philistines were going to attempt an end run. They couldn't come up the valley routes through the Elah, the Sorek, or the Ajalon valleys. So they're going to march all the way to the north to the Jezreel Valley with a camp at Bet Shan, and they're going to attempt to push south along the Patriarch's Highway. Saul got up onto the slopes of Mount Gilboa and saw the armies of the Philistines down below. He tried to talk to God, but couldn't. And that takes us to this famous episode of Saul and the witch at Endor. Endor is on the north side of the Jezreel Valley in the hills, not too far from the Sea of Galilee. Matter of fact, this photograph is taken not very far from Endor. Endor will be off to the right just a bit. So Saul says to his men, God isn't speaking to me anymore. Samuel is dead. I really need to know what's going to happen with the battle. Can you find me a witch, a medium, someone who can speak to the gods or speak to the dead for me? Now, Saul had already condemned all of the witches, told them to stop doing their thing. Nevertheless, Saul's men knew where there was a practicing medium or witch. So they told him there's one at Endor. And they ended up getting through the Philistine lines to Endor. And Saul had disguised himself, and they came to the woman by night. And Saul said, "Divine for me a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name for you." The woman said, "Well, you know that Saul has cut off all the mediums. This is a trap." And Saul said, "As the Lord lives, no punishment will come to you." And he said, "Bring up Samuel for me." So the woman did that. Now, how do you do that? Um, because as it turns out, the real Samuel comes up. The witch was not expecting Samuel to come up. When a witch brings up, quote, the dead, unquote, she's not really bringing up somebody who had been dead. I hope I don't need to explain that to you, because that doesn't generally happen. What the witch is talking to is a familiar spirit, a demon. The witch can talk to demons. Demons talk to witches. The witch is usually demon possessed, usually by quite a number of demons. This is a very bad thing for witches. And this particular witch uh, went into her routine, and she built a fire, and she built her pot, and she threw in some stuff in the pot, and she threw one piece that made a bunch of smoke. "Eye of newt and tail of bat, show us where old Samuel's at." And poof, a big smoke puff, and out of the fire walks Samuel himself. At that point, the witch screamed. I find that fascinating. She screamed. The woman cried out with a loud voice. She said, "Why have you deceived me? You're Saul." The king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" Then we have the conversation with Samuel. Samuel said, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I'm in great distress. The Philistines are after me, and God has turned away." And at the end of this, Samuel says, "The Lord," verse 19, "will give Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines. Tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines." So the prediction of death. So Saul fell full length, and he was filled with fear. Eventually, the witch and the men who were with him got him to eat and rest. Some, they went back through the lines, and that happened. In chapter 29, the Philistines reject David. He ends up going home to the town that the Philistines had given him, named Ziklag, only to find that the Amalekites had kidnapped all of the women and children and all the stuff. And so David had to fight a battle against the Amalekites to get everybody back and prevent a mutiny amongst his own men. Chapter 31, we see the account of the death of Saul on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. Saul was fighting against the Philistines, and it went badly for the men of Israel. And finally, the archers got close enough to be able to hit Saul. Saul and Jonathan and many others took arrow hits. Saul was being surrounded. He didn't know what to do. He asked his armor bearer to kill him because he was badly wounded, and he couldn't do it. So we're told in chapter 31 that Saul fell on his own sword and killed himself. Afterwards, the Philistines saw what had happened. They took the bodies of Saul and Jonathan and hung them on the wall of that mound in the background, Bet Shan. It was the men of Jabesh Gilead in the other side of the Jordan, whom Saul had delivered from the hand of the Ammonites not so long ago, who came in by night and stole those bodies and buried them under a tamarisk tree in Jabesh, and they fasted for days. And so there is the end of King Saul. And that's going to take us, as we get into 2 Samuel, into uh, the beginning of David's reign as a solo king. This is a complex story. There's a lot going on, and we're able to see David's operations on a fairly, well. Let's see. I'm supposed to be ending the share screen, and that should be there. Okay, I'm going to kill this. Bingo. Okay. Thank you all for watching. On Friday, we're going to go on into 2 Samuel. With any luck, we'll do the whole book of 2 Samuel on Friday. And by the way, this note for you, Oscar, I have to start teaching next Friday.
Okay.
So next week I'll do Monday and Wednesday, and it will be a Monday Wednesday rotation. I won't be able to teach on Fridays. Okay.
Okay.
All right. It's been a pleasure. Here comes Donna to get in on the goodbyes. We're glad that we can spend a little bit of time with all of you. We do look forward to coming to Italy and seeing you all again. And Oscar, if I could have you give us a call on Facebook in about 10 minutes. We need to talk for a couple.
Okay.
Okay. God bless everybody. We love you guys.
Good night, everyone. Thank you, Dr.
Bye-bye.
John.
Bye-bye, Joel. Bye-bye, Willie. Bye-bye, Joel. See you all.
Thank you again.
Thank you so
Our
much.
pleasure.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Salamat, guys. Happy birthday, Ninong.